Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to TIA's Lunch and Learn webinar, Selecting, Implementing, and Driving Adoption of the Right Tech in Your Business. My name is Jonathan Baker, and I'm the Director of Education at TIA, as well as your host for today's webinar. I'm happy to be joined by Ryan Schreiber, the Director of Engagement for Carrier Direct, and I will throw it over to him here in a couple of minutes. But first, we wanted to run through a little bit of housekeeping. If you go to the next slide for me, Ryan. We always start with our antitrust statement. So discussion, comments, and presentations during TIA functions must not, one, refer to any past, present, or future rates, prices, or anything related thereto. Two, include any reference to marketing strategies. Three, include any discussion of boycotts of any person, product, or firm. Or four, inhibit any members' employees from discussing employment with other member companies. Next slide, please. So with Zoom, there's two different ways that Ryan and I will take your questions today. One is through the Zoom control panel Q&A button. Just a caveat to that, if you submit your question through there, Ryan and I will be able to see it, but you probably won't, which is fine. We're going to make sure that we get through all those by the end of the presentation. The other way is through the chat function. So if you have a question, just drop it in there. I'll keep an eye on it while Ryan's doing his presentation. And like I said, we will get to those at the end of the presentation. Ryan's presentation also includes polling, and we value your feedback. So make sure you take the time to vote in those polls for us, because I believe that will inform Ryan on his talking points moving forward.
Well, that's the hope anyway.
Yeah, that's what we hope. You know, we're going to try our best to be respectful of everyone's time and get everybody out of here at 1. But if we have a good conversation going, we might go a little bit over. And we will be recording this webinar, and we will have it out for you to review within 24 hours of today. And I believe with that takes care of all the housekeeping. Ryan, I'm going to hand it over to you to take it from here.
All right, thanks. I suppose I thought the other way, that was just going to be shouting at their computers,
right,
as opposed to the chat function. But hey, everybody, I'm Ryan Schreiber, as Jonathan said, and Jonathan, thanks a lot for inviting us to do this again. This is always a lot of fun for us to do, to talk about some of the things that we're really passionate about. I'll just give a quick little introduction on Carrier Direct, so you kind of know where we're coming from if you haven't joined anything that we've done previously. Carrier Direct is a technology delivery and management consulting firm, and we focus exclusively on freight and transportation. So we work with companies like Redwood or Nolan Transportation Group, Werner, JB Hunt, FedEx, as well as smaller companies and just a small smattering there of the companies we work with. And we work on everything from process improvement to organizational design, compensation. And we also help with technology strategy and technology development, which is some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today. And because this is the only pond in which we swim, we see a lot and we know it really well. And I want to share with you guys today some of what we see to drive better adoption of technology within your organization. A little bit about me. I've spent over 10 years in the industry. I've started multiple brokerages along the way as well. And most recently was a tech-enabled broker where we were applying natural language processing or chatbots to drive efficiency. So something that's very near and dear to my heart of how do you get adoption. And with Carrier Direct, I kind of help educate our clients on what's the future of freight tech and how to help their businesses grow and mature. So before I kind of get into this, like the secret sauce of this webinar, like I can give it to you right now and you guys can hang up if you really want to. I mean, there's only two things that drive adoption. It comes down to making better choices on the front end and then doing change management afterwards. And that's basically it. I mean, we're going to spend the rest of the time here talking about how do you do those two things, but that's really what it comes down to. If you make better software selections on the front end, and then you actually invest in doing the change management and training, that's the long and the short of it. So we're going to start off with a poll, and because Jonathan and TI, this is a newer thing, asked us to work in some polls. So what is your biggest struggle with technology? Is it having been burned too many times, you picking the wrong thing, just didn't work the way you wanted it to, figuring out where to start and how to get going, getting things up and running, or maybe that your team members never even logged in to software that you selected or just didn't use it. So I don't exactly know how this thing works. I'm gonna kind of, I guess I'm gonna kind of keep. Does it,
Yeah, I
Jonathan?
would
Does it
just,
like show us?
yeah. So I'll share the results here in a second, Ryan. The votes are
Okay.
still coming in. It's got about 10 seconds left before it closes.
Oh, okay. Cool. It's good to know.
And there we go. You should be able to see those results
All
on the
right.
screen.
Cool. So getting up and running and team members never even logging in were, kind of the two equal votes there. So um, that's good to know, and we'll definitely touch on those. And that talks about really more to the change management side of things, doing implementation and doing training. So we'll definitely get to that later in the presentation. So this presentation is going to talk a lot about both buy and build options, right? Because that's things that people are always curious about. But throughout this is going to skew a little bit more buy, because in today's software environment, even companies that can afford to build everything should really be taking a hybrid buy build approach. That's a little bit for a different webinar of why, but we'll talk about on both buy and build, but we'll skew a little bit more buy. So first of all, let's talk about setting expectations up front. There are a few dead horses that I'm going to beat throughout this presentation, and it's really these four. This webinar is about technology, but it's not only about technology, right? The reality is that the biggest technology mistakes that we see when we work with companies are not technology mistakes at all. They're organizational mistakes. The first is tech investments are never done. And whether you buy or you build, you need to be constantly reviewing the decisions that you've made and keeping software up to date. So whether that's implementing new features or fixing what breaks, a huge mistake is thinking that you're done once you go live. And that's absolutely not the case. 2 and 3 are relatively self-explanatory. Tech can't solve all of your problems, and it's not an easy button. You have to make investments in technology to get better, but investing in software instead of investing in your business is a mistake that's absolutely going to lead you to waste money. So this is going to focus on technology, but there's a whole other webinar eventually about applying these to your organizational changes. But please don't lose sight of the fact that your organization may need to change things like compensation or team structures to really get the full power of technology that you select for your business. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but we won't go too far into that rabbit hole. And then finally, keep in mind that good software needs to fit your business. You select software with the realities of your business in mind. If you want futures focused software, that'll make your business different, you need to change your business too, but you absolutely shouldn't be chasing the shiny object. And those are the things that we'll kind of talk about here on how do you lay that foundation. But good software fits your business. Just because something looks cool or has cool promises doesn't mean you're going to really get the full benefit if it doesn't fit your business. So this slide touches a little bit on that poll that we just did. And here's how kind of it'll map to what we're going to talk about going forward. If you've been burned, it's usually because your expectations and reality were sort of at a mismatch. And typically that root cause is an idealized version of either where your organization is or what the software can actually do. You were sold, the product instead of really understanding what you were buying. Leaders often know the role, quote unquote, of a C-level employee, but they don't know the reality of what's happening today on the floor right now. It's a lot like having a kid, who's a teenager or a family member who's a teenager, right? Sure, we were all 16 once, but being 16 in 2020 is a lot different than being 16 in 1999 when I was 16. For one thing, there wasn't a pandemic, but there's lots of ways in which that's changed, TikTok or whatever. It's, a common example that I'd use here is let's say you want to book more loads and you also want to get off DAT. So you're going to use a carrier procurement tool, right? That is going to automate carrier communication. Well, That's a great goal. But if your reps are sure if that automated communication is going to book more carriers, or sorry, excuse me, that automated communication tool will help your reps book less off of DAT, but you still just have a bunch of DAT carriers in your TMS. They're automating the wrong carrier base. So, this is one of the reasons you really want to pick with your business in mind. Where to start is often an issue of planning and preparation. We constantly see leaders kind of chasing their tails and wasting resources, which is both time and money, because they don't follow through on that plan. And so we'll talk about that obviously as we go. But the reason is because you kind of get distracted by the what ifs, either that a software does that you want, or that it doesn't do everything that you want it to do. And so, like, for instance, if you're looking for a tool that helps your teams do spot pricing better, and you're looking at RFP management tools, it's not going to help you. But it's really sexy and cool to think about all of the possibilities. So having a plan is really the important part on where to start, because you can quickly kind of sift through the noise. Getting up and running is really about onboarding and implementation. You need to understand how a vendor can support you in that process. This really comes down to a risk profile, which I'll talk about in just a second, and then the company maturity of the software platform that you're selecting. Keep in mind as we talk about this that maturity does not equal tenure, right? What maturity really comes down to is how well they're going to be able to support you and how much they've built their product and their customer success teams out. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind. And then finally, the team members never never even logging in. It comes down to a lack of investment in training, and or the operating model changes that may be necessary, as I said before, right? So I'm going to beat this dead horse real quick. You may need to change the way you're doing things to get those explosive results that you want. You may need to change compensation to adjust for that carrier tool I mentioned earlier to get your carrier reps to drive their carriers towards automation, right? If they don't understand it intuitively, you need to make sure that they're getting the results that they need. So next, we're going to go to kind of where to start. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this slide right here, but a really easy place to start is to think about where your organization falls in the adoption lifecycle. And companies often wing this decision on a decision by decision basis without really defining it on the front end, because there's a ton of buzzwords, AI, machine learning. These are all really great and cool things, and I'm super passionate about all of them. But you need to understand what you as an organization can support and take on in those areas, and making this decision on the front end really, really matters, because otherwise you're going to waste time and you'll select software that doesn't fit your broader business strategy. It's going to make you less effective in aggregate by doing that, right? The further to the left that you fall, the bigger the opportunity, but also the bigger the investment, not necessarily monetary investment, but the support needed for the implementation, et cetera, because these tools are going to be built on the future of brokerage, not the current state of brokerage or the past brokerage environment that you're likely living in. And then this means it's going to make it more important the further left you fall to break some of those bad habits, reskill folks, as I talked about a moment ago. So this also impacts maturity. Typically, companies to the left are going to be less mature, which is going to require more from your team for training, for implementation, and for providing product feedback, so that you need to plan that out. And we'll talk about that later. There's some philosophical decisions that you're going to have to make as a business, which is, who do you want to be when you grow up? And this is starting to get into the meat of what we want to talk about here today. Something to know about me is I'm not going to read to you kind of bullet by bullet that's on every slide. So I'm going to try and keep things somewhat high level, even though I will probably talk a lot on each slide. Step one, you got to figure out where your business is going. A major issue with technology and companies we see is that they miss this first step, right? And so we're going to talk more tactically later, but before you even get into looking at software, you need to look downrange and figure out who you want to be when you grow up, and defining that as an organization. Because it makes a big difference. The most obvious example is if you want to unseat Uber or Convoy and disrupt freight and eventually go public, your choices are going to look a lot different than if you want to be a $5 million a year broker, right? And have a business that eventually you can hand off to your kids. So, key here, focus on realistic timelines and challenge yourself in the ways that you want to compete and how you want to win, right? Will you play an expedite or the over dim space? Are you going to be the best at booking carriers and that's where you're going to win? This is how you can start to communicate what differentiates you. And so you're not just saying you're good off each coast to the Midwest, you're good on coast to coast moves, right? This is the part of your business where you say, this is how we're going to win. And then you figure out how to build it throughout your organization. Step two, you've got to figure out what you can reasonably take on. And I cannot stress this enough because this is a huge miss and under a lack of understanding within businesses of what they are capable of actually getting accomplished to support technology in their business, selecting it, implementing it, and rolling it out, and then continuing to support it going forward. So, you've got to figure out where you are today. Look, I'm not saying don't be ambitious. It's incredibly important, right? I'm an entrepreneur. I understand how important ambition is, but you have to be realistic about what you can take on and actually accomplish or what those timelines might be, right? You have a lot going on in your business. You have to figure that out. You also have to figure out how you might be developing expertise that you need that you don't have today to serve the industries or the lines of business or the software environment you have in the future that you talked about or that you kind of aligned on in step one. So a big mistake that we see here that I'll just call out, misunderstanding or underestimating the total cost of ownership. Make sure you model out over time what it's going to look like to purchase and or build software, what it's going to look like to do the implementation, the maintenance, and the training. You need to model that out. The biggest mistake you can make is going cheap here because that's where you're lighting money on fire. The third step is going to be kind of defining success. And we'll talk about defining success more tactically later. Again, this is kind of on that 3 to 5 year time horizon. This is going to help you avoid the sunk cost fallacy. What's really important here is being specific. So as an example, a lot of times we sit with companies, you say, what are your goals? We want to grow. Well, that's really indistinct. So I'll give you a quick example. You remember 2015, the bottom fell out of rates. My brokerage that year, I grew 14% in revenue and I grew 47% in gross profit. Did I grow that year? Did I meet my goals? Like maybe, like kind of, it depends on how you define it, right? Because if I wanted to grow 30% year over year in revenue and in profit in both, one of them I blew out of the water, the other one I fell well short, right? So you got to get really specific on what your goals mean. Set discrete goals for each area that you want to impact. And it doesn't mean that you didn't do okay, right? If you had that same example, like, hey, I grew in revenue and I grew in profit, but I didn't quite grow in revenue as much as I wanted, that's fine. It just means that's where you need to focus going forward. Keep doing what you're doing to get profit. Focus on what you're going to do to generate revenue. Another kind of like pro tip here, focus on areas that are like a big risk factor. Consider the biggest risk factors to your business. So, customer concentration is a great example that we see in small and mid-sized businesses is a huge risk factor. If 50+% of your business, or even in some instances, even 30+% of your business is coming from one customer, that's a huge risk area. So set some goals around, set some of your defining success metrics around your risk factors like customer concentration, right? Because in that situation, if they get acquired or they get a new logistics manager, like you're shit out of luck, right? Also focus on sort of tangential things to your business as you think about scaling. If you do produce, don't jump to over dimensional. Start to scale out tangential pieces to your business to hit some of your kind of your growth goals. The same is true from a technology perspective. Unless you're going to make substantial investments in software, you need to grow incrementally in that respect and not try and just kind of boil the ocean, as we say. There's another poll here, apparently. How do you define success for your new technology? Is it improving lives for your employees, minimizing human error, helping grow your business, giving you a competitive advantage, or making better use of your data?
Yeah, Ryan, the votes are coming in right now. We've got about 20 seconds.
10, 9. Should we, somebody needs, like, next time I do this, somebody have like a video of the ball in Times Square.
Right. Some kind of countdown clock would be helpful, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Learning, lean iterative development.
All right. And there's your results.
All right. So help you grow your business. Great goal. Obviously, we'll talk a lot about, obviously talk a lot about that. Minimizing human error, another really important one, and then making better use of your data. It's definitely something that you have to unlock through a broader technology strategy. So we'll talk about all of these as we go forward. Selection. So we talked about kind of like where to start, right? So where to start has very little to do with software and everything to do with figuring out kind of your business and who you are and what you can take on. So selection and procurement is more like in the nitty gritty, right? Of now you've understood the big picture. How do you go about, how do I go about like getting into the software part of this universe? You need to see the forest and the trees is kind of the most important thing when you're looking to apply technology to a problem. And because too often we see that technology selections are made in a vacuum, right? So companies will go after what's new and cool, but marrying your business imperatives with your broader business strategy is how you really identify the opportunity space within your business for technology. And it helps you cut out the noise of quote unquote so much tech because you're able to focus in. So you need to sit with users to understand what they need to do in their day-to-day jobs and understand what's missing. What are the workarounds they're doing? What are the ways in which current technology isn't driving the results that you want for your customers and your freight mix? So once you go into talking to vendors, you're talking a lot more about your business and not all of their customers. You can understand it a lot better. You'll use this information, by the way, to understand where those opportunities are, and because they are at the intersection of the reality of how your people are doing their jobs, your goals, and a new future state that you have in mind to meet those goals, right? This matching exercise is kind of what we call defining requirements or capabilities. It's the features and functionalities that your software is going to need to have in this future state to kind of help accomplish those goals. And you've identified those new opportunities within kind of their workflows, right? You want to document all of this so that you can use it later. And once you've decided where you're going to look, a really important pro tip, look at those users' workflows, right? They do this, then they do this, then they do this, and pay particular attention to what happens before a user might engage with a piece of technology and what they might do right after. Because that's a lot of times what's missed is being really myopic about about exactly the problem that they want to solve with the software. Because often companies select software that could help users be better, but they don't consider how the user might engage with that software within their workflow, which ends up adding complexity and hurting adoption. So zoom up a little bit and really make sure that when you're evaluating software and you're understanding how it fits within that user's workflow, is it going to add 2 or 3 more user interfaces, right? Or another website that a user has to log into. If that's the case, that may add too much complexity to get adoption. It's one of the reasons that software often fails in aggregate. And it also is one of the reasons that it falls short of hitting your success metrics that you've defined and you can review later. All of this is to help you also understand what else might need to change in your business, right? You defined your broader business strategy. You define what your software needs to do. So now look at your organization and understand how users' jobs will change, right? And how you may, like I talked about before, if you select a tool that's going to automate some of your carrier procurement, right? Let's say you want your users to drive their carriers toward an automated booking platform. Well, how's that going to affect their compensation? Are they going to still get comped on those? Why would they do that? Those are some things that you really want to consider as to like why they would do it and how to adjust your operating model to adjust to account for that. You also might need to change the way your carrier sales teams are organized, right? You may need to have carrier sales teams that are focused on sourcing carriers that are good for automated booking, and another team that's focused on the carriers that need that human intervention, all of which impact your cost of service and make you more or less money, as we talked about in that last poll. So that's really important to help you have that money to invest and grow. Next, you need to understand where technology capabilities are within your organization, and define those gaps. Because as we talked about with data a minute ago, I won't spend too much time on this. You may need data you don't have. You may need access. You may not have access to that data now. You may need to change the way your teams are doing the work to get data into the system. If you have like a carrier CRM, and I keep talking about carrier sales, but if you have a carrier CRM, you may need to adjust again the team structure to make sure that there are people focused on information gathering and not just slinging freight, right? That's something you might need to consider. And then again, defining success on the front end. And this says, you might be saying like, hey, this says the same thing that it said on the other slide, and it absolutely does. But again, but this is getting more tactical. You were looking big picture before. Now get really, really tactical. Because look, ROI is a great kind of metric, but it's also a cop-out. How are you going to define success? If you ask a sales rep, hey, what's the ROI on this? They've got that teed up. They're going to be able to sell you some bullshit with the ROI calculation. So get really, really specific so you can understand how this might help you. So if you want to, I talked about earlier, I want to get off DAT. Well, it's pretty easy to measure whether or not you're on DAT or not on DAT, but that's not actually the goal, right? Your goal is increasing carrier reuse or lowering costs of service or increasing quality of service, right? Those are the things that you want to be able to measure, and that you can talk to a software vendor, or you can design a piece of software to actually attack. And then you're not just threatening to turn off DAT tomorrow because you reps won't get off of DAT. You're understanding better how this will impact that. And then be specific and put timelines to things. I want to increase my carrier reuse from 3 loads a day, buy 3 loads a day in the next 2 months, and buy to 10 loads a day in the next 6 months. Okay, now you can have conversations about how the software you're looking at will impact those goals. And then you can review how it did impact those goals after you make a selection, and avoid the sunk cost fallacy, rip things out that aren't working. I'll talk quickly about buy versus build and how to make decisions to buy versus build, because it's something that we get asked about all the time. And it's a really, really big decision. So first, I'm going to tell you our philosophy, which is again, a larger topic for another webinar, is if you're going to build, buy what you can and build what you have to, or what differentiates you. Like a good example of this is you're not going to build an accounting software, right? It's a waste of money. And it's true that like a lot of folks want to build because they think it's what really gives them a competitive advantage. And it can, but focus on buying what you can and building what's going to be your secret sauce, right? So let's walk through this just quickly. In the last slide, I talked about capabilities, right? So as you do these business imperatives, you're going to have capabilities that your software is going to need. And that comes from documenting those business imperatives and those user workflows. As an organization, you need to align on things like must-haves, nice-to-haves, and additional considerations, which I'll talk about in more detail in the next slide, but align on those capabilities. So then you can survey the market for expectations for that minimum functionality or table stakes, those must-haves. Determine whether or not those are on the market and available to you. And then you can make a decision. If those are available and there's the cost considerations make sense to buy, go ahead and buy, right? Buy, do the implementation, that kind of thing. And some of the other considerations, not just cost, but how well a vendor can support you based on where your technology organization is and the goals that we set out earlier, as I talked about, right? If not, then you should consider building, because it might provide you a competitive differentiator. So this talks about what's the software evaluation for, what's the process for software evaluation. if you're going to buy off the shelf. So first, you are going to look for what are your deal breakers. So as I talked about before, this is absolutely critical to the successful procurement. Tech companies want to sell you the shiny object, and that's functionality that looks cool and maybe works well, but like it doesn't actually necessarily fit the functionality you need. So what are the different kind of categories? You have deal breakers. That's the absolute must-have functionality. If your vendor doesn't have this functionality, you're just straight up not even going to move to a demo. Like you can figure that out on the front end. And this primarily represents maybe either functionality that has in a system that's being replaced, or that represents making it worth it to go get software to do this work. Differentiators like highly desired functionality that could be, an enabler for your business, and it helps you maybe perform over the next 12 months, but you're willing to potentially trade off depending on, again, price, the vendor support, et cetera. And additional considerations are really just those nice to haves. Like they'd enable some long-term business strategy or help you open up like a new market or something to that effect, but are really going to just kind of be weighting factors at the end if all things are equal between a couple of vendors. Here's a great example of why this is important. We went through a TMS selection with a large carrier or broker, and a must-have was bilingual functionality, right? That would native to the application because they had cross-border operations for Mexico. And we were able to cut out many leading candidates, including the one that they were like, before hiring us, they were going to go with in the first phase before we even got to demos, because it didn't have that functionality. It was a must have. They needed it to natively support Spanish. So it helps, again, save your time and cut down on the noise. Once you have these deal breakers, you call the vendors, you figure it out. And then, as I've said before, or as I've intimated a few times, there is no overall best technology for brokerage. If you ask me what's the best TMS or what's the best carrier procurement tool, it all depends on your business needs. Again, the example of automating carrier sales. If you have a good carrier base, yeah, look towards automating carrier reach out tools. If you don't, if you have a bunch of DAT carriers, you need to look toward a carrier CRM that can help you rebuild that, as an example. You'll do a pre-demo questionnaire and some live demos. Like those are relatively straightforward, right? You can send them a written demo on the questionnaires. I won't spend much time on that. The live demo, there's some really good pro tips in here. You do not let the vendor walk you through some sort of canned demo, right? You need to focus the demo on your deal breakers and the workflow and capabilities that you are looking for. Send this use case right over to them, like right beforehand. Like as an example, if you want, again, I'm going to use carrier CRM. You want them to better profile carriers, make them walk you through what it's like entering a carrier into the system. How does you enter a lane, right? How do you see what the available matches are for capacity? That's your desired workflow, because then you'll understand how it fits within a user's current workflow, as we talked about earlier. Another pro tip, make them show you, do not let them show you in a sandbox environment or a demo environment. Make them show you the features and functionalities in production. Often software vendors will show you what may be coming down the pipe, but that isn't live today. And it can cause some huge kind of headaches for both you and them when you go to select. The technical questionnaire and technical interview piece, this is really super boring for most folks who are going to be on this call. So all I'm going to say is this part's about understanding how they'll engage with your current team. And if you have a technology organization that has some maturity, you're going to want to know things like DevOps and data structures, architecture, how they're going to do integrations, how they're going to do authentications. If not, focus on things like how will they integrate the software with other softwares that you're using that you may need, and also what it's going to be like engaging with their teams from a support and maintenance perspective or implementation. Finally, you're going to be left with some viable candidates. Like at each step, you've been kind of eliminating and saving yourself time along the way, right? From just going all the way down the path with multiple vendors. So as an example, and those are the ones that you can start negotiating with, right? Or picking kind of between the nice to haves and additional considerations, because they have all of your must haves in the system. As a quick example, once we did a TMS selection that talked about earlier, where we started with 61 candidates, and over 5 weeks, we were left with only 6 viable candidates. But we were able to cut out so many early in the process that we saved a ton of time for us and for that client. And those are the things you can do as well. I'm just going to quickly talk about build. Again, like, build is something you absolutely can and should do for the things that differentiate you. But make sure you're building the right stuff to get adoption. And the way to do that is to not go into a hole and just build a big thing and then roll it out to users. The way to do that is to go through a lean iterative development process, which I joked about earlier around the poll thing. But what that is you start with a design phase where you look, again, you kind of similar to last time, you have deal breakers, you have nice to haves. You then prioritize those in a build scenario to say, hey, these are the things that we absolutely have to have in a minimum viable product. Minimum viable product, this is the thing that's going to make this thing like work even at all. And then you spend a short amount of time doing that, getting it off the ground, and then you work with users and pilot it over time, adding more users, getting more feedback, and go through different phases: pilot, phase 2, phase 3. You continue to build on it to help make sure that you're building the right things and that you're getting user adoption, because you're really close to those users. Make sure you allot enough time for this if you're going to do it, especially pilot and testing, because you really want to make sure the application can support users in it. It's not going down every 10 minutes. But if you can justify the trade-offs of off the shelf, building is actually very possible in today's environment. And this is how you go about it. All right, I'm going to get into implementation now. So, implementation is probably the biggest bugaboo. And at a high level summary, you think you've bought a great system, right? Everybody on the front end didn't say, hey, I felt like I didn't get what I, kind of selected. I just have trouble getting people to use it. Okay, so implementation is a great place to start. We're going to talk about technical implementation. We're also going to talk about human implementation. So you think you bought a great system, and it is great, but it's not great off the shelf, right? Salesforce isn't great by default. It's really highly configurable. You need to spend the time and energy doing it. A huge pitfall is going cheap in implementation and not really going through all of the steps, right? So some pitfalls to avoid a rep overselling a system. We talked about how to do that before by focusing them on your workflows. And the system not working as well in the demo. Again, focusing them toward showing you something in the environment. So we covered how to do those. Best practices of configuration. Really, configuration equals time and money. So budget on the front end, as I talked about earlier, right? That's how before you even get to this stage, you understand, you've talked to the vendors about what the budget is, what the total cost of ownership is, and you understand really what that's going to take to get done. Now you need to commit to it. And some really important things to think about from an implementation and configuration perspective: importing your historical data, getting all the integrations and the user things set up, and then make sure you're engaging their support teams to help de-risk an implementation and what that looks like. Those are some really important those are really important things to do in the implementation phase. And then some expert tips here. Look, the biggest mistake that we see is not maintaining software that you bought or keeping it up to date with enhancements. Budget time and money to that and stay close to it. Fix things that break and keep getting the most out of it. I mean, all of us have probably bought a TMS that we implemented, it worked the way we wanted it to. They start rolling some things out, and then all of a sudden this didn't work or that didn't work, and you just don't devote the time or energy to getting those things fixed. And eventually you have a TMS that doesn't work anything like you thought it would, right? And you wasted all that money on the front end. Finally, I want to just, application versus service. A lot of software, and a lot of people assume when they're paying for software that they get the product and they get the tech support. That's not the case. Really, off the shelf software, there's a difference between application, the actual software, and then the service that those companies provide. Engaging their professional services teams can be really important, and make sure you budget for that appropriately. Tech buyers spend often too much time sort of like they found they've paid too little for support and they really need it. So don't scrimp here. Budget double the cost on an in-house implementation, and maybe 25 to double, 25% to 100% in services for like cloud providers that you might be talking to. So making sure you understand that is really, really important. A lot of smaller off-the-shelf products, it's really just going to be who's maintaining APIs, how is that going to be, integrations, how's that going to be done, and how long do those things take is really going to be important to understand for smaller providers. Larger providers, things like a TMS, it's really going to be constant functionality things you need to look to. I think this is our second to last poll. How often do you offer training for the tech that you use in your business? Maybe the Jeopardy music, maybe not a countdown, but like the final Jeopardy music when they're like all writing down their
that's the way we should have
answers.
Put that in before.
Yeah. Next time.
For next time.
Yeah. We're learning.
We got about 10 seconds left. And here we go. Let me share those results for you.
All right. Ad hoc is 2/3, and we figured out as we go as a third. All right. Well, that's not so great. So that's what we're here to talk about the most. So first, I'm going to talk about kind of like change management broadly, and then I'm going to talk about training. Good change management is crucial to ensure adoption and successful implementation at the seat level. And change management is the most important thing that companies need to do more of broadly, and particularly here. So a structured approach to change management should be followed. And many people mistakenly believe that change management is just about communication, but it's more than that. First of all, start early. Bring people into the process. You've done that. If you've done the stuff we talked about before, where you sat with users, you understood their workflows, you understood the capabilities, you've started to bring them into the process, which is great and really important. But the earlier that you start communicating in change management, the better. So at Carrier Direct, we have a five-phased approach. First, you need to align leadership, right? This involves getting everyone in the leadership level aligned on the key strategic benefits associated with this new technology, which hypothetically, if you followed the process we've talked about so far, you've done that, right? But also kind of documenting that so it can be communicated to employees is really important. Then it's not about just communicating the change, which you'll talk about later. There's communicating the vision. It's important that you kind of explain to employees early on who don't have all the details, why you're doing this, what you want to accomplish, what's the broader vision for the business, why is software going to be important in doing that, and why this benefits them, which I'll talk about again in a second in terms of training. The third step, define the change. It's important to clearly define that desired future state I've mentioned earlier and understand the impacts to the business as a result, right? And migrating away from your current state to this future one, right? Once we understand the changes, we can start to design that change, what we call intervention, such as communication, training, what other activities may be necessary. Again, you may need to change people's jobs. You may need to change your operating model. You need to change compensation. All of those might need to happen in your future state. And once we understand what that change is going to kind of entail, we can start designing that. Then there's quote unquote executing the change. So you've been executing the change because you've been communicating, et cetera. This is the moment of making all of those shifts, the things that are maybe more than just communication. So you're delivering those activities. You're moving people into new roles. You're talking to them about their new job titles. You're rolling out the new compensation plans. You're doing the training, depending on what you need. And then monitoring the success of the change. Look, change management, again, is not an event. So you need to be kind of like continually to check in post go live to ensure that you've got adoption. If you need to retrain, if you need to deliver, kind of like tweak the compensation, whatever those things are that maybe you missed on the front end, like it's okay. You didn't miss the opportunity wholly. Check in, keep doing that. One thing that we really love in this phase is this continual communication. So surfacing wins when somebody does what you ask them to do, right? Hey, we wanted you guys to do this way. Tim did. Tim booked 25 more loads, or Tim got 3 new customers and it counted for 5K in gross profit this week. Great job, Tim. He's doing what we're asking him to do. It helps show employees that like there can be success with that. It helps drive adoption. So broadly, change management, super important. And something we certainly could do a whole webinar about, even though it would be super boring. So I'm going to talk about training again for a second. So training is all about tell them and then tell them again, and then tell them again, and then tell them again. Don't do training once. Don't do it ad hoc. Training is something that you absolutely have to invest in to get adoption of your new software. And the biggest miss here is just focusing on what buttons to click, right? That's a huge miss in training. Don't just focus on click this button, then click this button. As we talked about communicating the vision, help users understand the other things. Don't just sell them some BS. Like, think about their incentives and be really tactical and specific about what's better for them and why the vision is what it is. So like, if your carrier rep's going to use this, don't just tell them it'll make them more money. Show them how it'll make them more money. Show them the math in this training. As an example, say something like, Jenny last book, if Jenny, somebody on your carrier team, she booked 8 loads last month, 8 loads a day last month. This software is going to help her get to 10 in these ways that we understood from the vendors that we cataloged earlier, A, B, C. So last month, her average gross margin was $150 a shipment. This product's going to help her get to $200 a shipment in this way, X, Y, Z, that we talked about with the vendors, that we know, that we looked at, that we vetted. So because of that, Jenny's going to make another $2,000 in gross profit. Really show them tactically how, and then tell her what it's going to do for their compensation. That's how you can show them what it really means to them at the seat level. Not just say, this is going to be great. Everybody's going to love it. You're going to book so many more loads. How many more loads? How? Not how are we going to book more loads? How is this making me more efficient? How is this making me more money? Get really tactical on that stuff, and not just the buttons, but what is different about this? And you want to show them that you understand their job, right? So we talked about that mapping of the workflow earlier. You're going to ask them to change. That comes with friction. Don't undersell that, right? Don't kind of paper it over. But again, kind of, hey, Tim, this will be easier for you in the long run. I understand it's right now, but this is what's going to change. And this is how I want to interact you to interact with this before and after. And this is why it's good for you. That's really important. The last thing I'm going to say about training before we get to some takeaways here, don't forget the forgetting curve. Everyone forgets, even me, and I have a really great memory. If you ask me in the moment, I'd be like, no, I remember everything. But the reality is I'm certain that I forget things. But everybody learns differently. And this is why it's super important to tell people and keep training them, because we hear constantly, well, I showed them how to use it. And okay, great. Yeah, you showed them how to use it that one time, ad hoc, real quick, while they were in the middle of doing 5 other things. Like, people just don't learn that way. When you dump a bunch of information on people, they retain even less. So if you try and do like a drinking from a fire hose type training, they retain even less than they would if you do it in a really structured manner. So rushing training is a really huge mistake. You're honestly better off just like not doing software, not getting new software, not doing training at all, than not planning it and not doing it effectively. So remember, people will forget over time. So don't just tell them one time. Keep retraining on things over time. It doesn't have to be every day, but once a quarter, once a month, whatever it might need to be, to keep that information fresh and reset that forgetting curve. So here are our takeaways from this webinar, and I can't believe it's already been 47 minutes. Adoption comes from making better choices and doing change management. And that's what I said on the front end. Like, that's it. Boom, hard stop. you just wasted 46 minutes of your life because I told you that's what I was going to tell you. Selection and implementation equal adoption. Training is more how to and why. And then, do your prep work. Don't just dive right into looking at software selection. Make sure you understand who you want to be when you grow up. Make sure you understand what you want the software to accomplish really tactically. And then be in it for the long haul. Do that. Do the maintenance, do the check-ins and the self-care, which is really critical for success. So I guess our last poll is, how excited are you to apply these learnings in your business? And we'll get into questions.
Ryan, this might be my favorite question that you came up with.
Thank you. All the credit goes to Teresa, our director of marketing, who threw this in. I was like, this is good. This is a little cheeky. I like it.
Yeah. We've got about 10 seconds left before we'll close this poll. Make sure you get your vote in. I will say, Ryan, they're mostly very excited.
That's good. This one let me vote, so I also voted. And I said I was extremely excited.
I might be cheating. I don't know.
Yeah. The other ones, it said I couldn't vote, but this one said I could. So this is the footer for the next slide. I guess the question and answer slide didn't get in here, but we'll go with it.
Thanks, Ryan, for that presentation. So just a reminder, if you do have questions for Ryan, put it in the Q&A button in your Zoom control panel or in the chat. We'll get to those in just a minute. I do have a couple of questions for you, Ryan. The first one is, do we need to create our own training program in addition to whatever out-of-box training might come with purchased software?
Wow. A real solid maybe. So, early on, I talked about sort of understanding from the vendor side of things. Actually, let me rephrase that. Absolutely 100% you have to. How much is a real solid, kind of open question. Understanding where the vendor kind of falls on the maturity scale is really important. Often vendor focused training, to the extent that any of it exists, focus on what buttons to click. So you need to focus on the impacts that you want it to have to your folks, right? The organizational type stuff, the changes to their role, how it's going to impact the money that they make, et cetera, the why that we talked about, and then how it fits within their workflow and how it fits within your organization. But definitely, different vendors will have different levels of maturity around the training that they can offer on how to actually use their software. Review that, certainly, even before, if you're coming down to kind of like two equally placed vendors, take a look at their training to understand whether or not, one is significantly better than the other, because again, they have different maturity in that sense.
All right. The next question is, what are some good exercises to determine deal breakers for software?
Yeah, I would start with jumping jacks. No, just kidding. Some good exercises is certainly it's really understanding what does your business have to operate the freight that you have and operate the freight that you want to have on your timelines. So honestly, the best way to do that is engaging your current employees. And certainly what we hear all the time is, well, they don't understand, or they're not doing the job the right way, or they don't know where we want to go. They don't have the vision. And that's actually the biggest reason to do it. So sitting with them and understanding and asking them, okay, what do you need to do your job every day? What do you need to do your job? Like, a phone is an example of that. So there's no other way to do it other than really getting into the nitty gritty with those users and helping them understand what they have to have and what they don't have within the system today. There's no better way to do it. So just seat level interviews is the way to go about it.
All right. And then Ryan, are there any technology specific types of training that you have seen work well with employees? Training with people in a classroom on leadership skills is very different from training them on how to use technology. So
it isn't actually. I mean,
Right.
To that point, like, it is and it isn't. You absolutely want, look, I mean, it's not to say, when I say, hey, don't just focus on what buttons to click, that doesn't mean don't ever talk to them about what buttons to click. Start by painting the vision and helping them understand, how it's going to work for them, et cetera. And that's something that certainly should be done in multiple conversations in a classroom setting, is good as well. And then work in activities for helping them to use, figuring out how to use the software. Depending on the complexity of the software, consider breaking that up into multiple button clicking type sessions, focused on their workflows, right? There are some really robust tools out there that can do many things. Start by focusing on the most common workflow, and then over time, work in some of those other ones so that you're not doing it. But you definitely want to do a classroom setting that's, maybe more managerial mindset type training, and then focus on the activities and break those up over time.
All right. I believe that was our last question. So I think
those are hard hitting questions for sure.
I know, right? I think this is where we'll wrap it up. So thank you again,
Great.
Ryan and Carrier Direct, for that great presentation. And thank you again to everyone who was able to join us today. Tuesday next week, just in case you didn't know, we have another great Lunch and Learn webinar coming up with Eric Zalud and Helen Schweitz from Binish, Friedlander, Copeland, and Aronoff LLP. They're going to be talking about new IP and IT technologies to discover a logistics pot of gold, believe it or not. So amazing, right?
Is it over the rainbow? Well, I guess we'll have to come next week to find out.
Yep, you'll have to find out on Tuesday. And with that, I wanted to thank everybody once again, and we hope you have a safe, happy, and healthy rest of your day.
Oh, thanks, everybody.